make sure I got that straight. Okay, today is Monday, May 23rd. And today we are interviewing Mark Weber, who is known as a local professional editor of what was known as the Eden Prairie News, and for the last 3 years you've been the executive director of the Eden Prairie Foundation.
Yeah, let me encapsulate. I'm Mark Weber. I'm a longtime Eden Prairie resident. I was connected with the Eden Prairie News from 1979 to 2013 and have been executive director of the Eden Prairie Community Foundation for about the last 8.5 years.
And so today, Monday, May 23rd, we're going to take a walk through your former personal as well as professional life and get to know Mark Weber, the person, as well as the journalistic professional and philanthropic professional too, we might add. So you were saying you grew up in Detroit Lakes and your family finally settled down after several moves along about your age 8 or 9. And then tell me a little bit more about some of the experiences you had that made you think you want to be in journalism.
Yeah, well, Detroit Lakes was a great place to grow up. We were a couple blocks from the lake. It was just a good experience overall. But I've always been a reader, and the local newspaper was part of that. I would kind of pour through the local papers, Detroit Lakes Tribune and the Becker County Record, for local names that I knew. And I'd substitute for my buddy John Mackner on his paper route some days and hang outside the newspaper office in Detroit Lakes, which I found quite interesting. But I graduated from high school in 1973, and that was right in the middle of the Watergate scandal. And I guess if there was anything that maybe influenced me most to go into journalism, that was probably it.
I can understand that. So you went to post-secondary college at Bemidji State?
Bemidji State University.
All right.
Yes.
All right.
Which was Bemidji State College when I actually arrived, and then became Bemidji State University while I was there.
And what's the team mascot up there?
It's the Beaver.
The Beaver.
Of course, yes.
That's important for us to know.
And the high school team in Bemidji, I think, is the Lumberjacks.
Okay. All right. Which would you prefer, being a lumberjack or a beaver?
Yeah. Yeah, lumberjack wielding that axe, I guess, is pretty awesome.
Right.
Image.
Right.
There.
Okay. I totally understand. So so you went to school at Bemidji State. Were you in sports back then?
Not in college,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
You know, I focused on journalism almost from the start there. I think I
Okay.
joined the student newspaper at Bemidji and stuck with that for a number of years. And then also had a stint with the daily paper in Bemidji, the Bemidji Pioneer, working there part-time.
Okay, got it. And as you think back, are there any people in your life that you would consider to be a role model, either for you personally or professionally?
Well, I had a lot of good English teachers in middle school and high school. The role models, I would say, probably came later on, people that I worked with that taught me a lot about journalism. People like Dick Dahl, who was the editor of the Eden Prairie News when I arrived in 1979, and had a lot of journalism training and really shared a lot of his knowledge with me.
And when you got to the Eden Prairie News, what was your first job there?
Just a cub reporter. So I was 2 years out of college, working for a small paper out in Carver County, when a gentleman named Stan Rolfsrud approached me and asked if I was interested in a reporter position in Eden Prairie.
Mhm.
And Stan would turn out to be my boss for about the next 25 years.
Ah, what was his last name?
Rolfsrud.
Okay, I can almost spell that. Let's see, Rolfsrud, R-U-D. Right?
Rolfsrud. Yes, good Scandinavian name.
Well, there's one Scandinavian to another. I kind of know how that goes. So he was your boss for 25 years, and then you basically took over from him?
Yeah, eventually I worked my way up at the Eden Prairie News, starting as reporter.
Yeah.
I was editor, I
Sure.
was publisher, I was general manager of the parent company.
Mhm.
And I served in that capacity for about 9 years before I left in 2013.
Gotcha. Okay. So, how would you compare journalism in Minnesota to other parts of the U.S., as you know, with local newspapers, that type of thing?
Yeah, that's hard for me to do because I don't have the experience in other states.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that 1980s, for example, when I was with the Eden Prairie News, that was really one of the heydays of local community newspapers in Minnesota,
Mhm.
and there were hundreds of them at that time. Very vibrant, successful newspapers doing lots of interesting things, and
Mhm.
I guess I'll kind of regard that as the golden age of
Mhm.
local newspapers in Minnesota, the
Yeah.
1980s.
A great time to come of age as a reporter for community papers then.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay. And so I guess I was going to ask you what made you decide to stick around, but it sounds like you had a good boss and you were in a good organization.
I did. You know, I was in Eden Prairie for a little over a year when there was an editor job that opened in Prior Lake.
Uh-huh.
Same company, different community.
Mm-hmm.
And I took that because it was a step up.
Okay.
Hated it. Couldn't wait to get back to Eden Prairie,
Ah,
to be totally honest. And so I was there in Prior Lake for about a year or two. And sure enough, the editor position in Eden Prairie opened, and I snapped it up pretty quick. And I think one of the keys there is I had probably realized that Eden Prairie was already my home.
Mhm.
That's where I wanted to be.
mm-hmm.
And, you know, I'm not sure everybody in Eden Prairie appreciates this, but, you know, there are a lot of people in Eden Prairie from that period
Mm-hmm.
who were involved in everything and doing all kinds of things to create a better community. And we kind of stand on their shoulders
Yeah.
today, but it was quite a group.
Mm-hmm.
And I could tell that there was something special
Mm-hmm.
going on in Eden Prairie. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I had the chance to get back and I snapped at it.
Okay. So there were a lot of newsmakers back in that time in Eden Prairie.
Yeah, people that were involved in almost everything,
Mhm.
so they weren't
Sure.
involved in just one thing, but they
Right.
were creating all kinds of things like Lions and
Mhm.
Rotary and the Crime Prevention Fund and the Chamber of Commerce and
Mm-hmm.
just all kinds of
Yeah,
organizations.
a lot of vibrant service clubs going on,
Yeah.
and they were there.
Right.
What would you say, what comes to mind is maybe a few of the top stories in Eden Prairie that you got to cover?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll say we had a lot of good reporters that I was working alongside
Mm-hmm.
during that time. Lots of
Mhm.
good young folks that were doing a lot of the coverage.
Mhm.
But just looking back, I mean, we wrote hundreds of articles on topics like new Highway 212, the expansion of Flying Cloud landfill, proposals to expand runways at Flying Cloud Airport. I mean, hundreds of articles on those things
Mhm.
year in and year out. But I would say, the recurring theme obviously was growth.
Mhm.
Everything almost was related to growth.
Mhm.
So, I would go to a city council meeting,
Mhm.
and there would be tens of millions of dollars in development on one agenda,
Mm.
one meeting agenda.
Mhm.
And Eden Prairie was, for a long time there in the 80s and maybe even into the 90s, one of the fastest growing cities in Minnesota,
Sure,
if not
yeah.
the fastest growing city in Minnesota. So everything was really growth related
Mhm.
at that time.
Mhm. And then you switched over to the Eden Prairie Foundation, and what was the year you started with them?
Yeah, 2013.
Right, okay, I thought so.
I bailed on the newspaper industry,
Right.
which was sort of in retraction at that time.
Right, it kind of flattened
Yeah.
out.
And my kids were grown, and I
Yeah.
was kind of looking for something different. And
Mhm.
the foundation happened to be looking for its first full-time executive director.
Yeah. What would you say were some of the challenges that you were facing as the new executive director at the foundation?
Well, they had had a part-time executive director for a year or two before I came on board,
Mhm.
all volunteer prior to that, by the way. And she was great, and put in some of the systems to really get the foundation established. But when I came, there was still a lot to be done. They were not investing funds, for example. They didn't have an endowment fund. There were just systems like that were not in place,
Mhm.
that we got going, that really have paid off for us.
Mhm. So when you say they were not investing funds, what was that about?
Well, they had money at the local bank,
And just it wasn't going anywhere?
wasn't going anywhere, and
Yeah.
so, we wanted to make sure that that money was invested, especially the money that, wasn't needed for day-to-day operations.
Mhm.
So some of the long-range funds for granting and
Mhm.
savings and things like that, we wanted to make sure it was working for us.
Yeah. And so how would you describe the foundation's impact when you first took over and its impact now as you're leaving? Tell us kind of how it's evolved.
Yeah, so the foundation is really focused around philanthropy and collaboration and leadership, and I think we've been able to grow in all of those. Today it has assets of, we're approaching $2 million in assets, and I think it had less than $400,000 when I came on board. The granting has increased substantially. We've been able to create donor-advised funds that are used by philanthropic Eden Prairie families to grant the things that they're passionate about, and we've grown that aspect of it. We're the fiscal sponsor to, almost a dozen small organizations that need and use our 501c3 status, and they're doing some granting. So when you talk about that, the granting from all of that has greatly increased. Last year it was close to $240,000, in a calendar year that was granted through the foundation. And so that's substantial impact that you're making each and every year.
And would you say there are particular areas of impact that a lot of the money has gone toward, either, be it homelessness or, hunger, housing? Where would you say the bigger areas that the foundation its funds have played a role?
Yeah, well, you're right. Naturally, it's social services. That's the lion's share of it. But, our other funding priorities are education, arts and culture, and recreation and entertainment. Check that, recreation the environment. And we have granted in all of those areas, and we usually do each year. There's some granting done in all of those areas, but social services certainly is the big one. And recently, we've tried to move beyond just granting to kind of a higher level, which would be increasing the capacity of our nonprofit partners. And so there's about 80-some nonprofits and civic organizations that are serving Eden Prairie. So we're working to make them better. We're trying to offer some low-cost training and things like board governance to make those organizations better. And then even a higher level than that is systemic change. So trying to change policy and kind of get at the root causes of things. And right now that would include things like affordable housing. And we've worked a little bit in the area of unemployment. So just taking that impact beyond granting, which we're still doing a lot of, to kind of a higher level.
Yeah. There's a lot of creativity, I would imagine, that would go along with that kind of effort.
Well, you know, community foundations have this amazing toolbox of tools that are available to them, and not every community has a community foundation. There are only about 800 across the country.
Yeah.
And so Eden Prairie is really lucky to have one.
So when you say tools, what are some examples of these tools?
Yeah, so one I mentioned is this ability to hold donor-advised funds, you know, for families that want to grant to things that they're passionate about. So we have donor-advised funds. The other one I mentioned is fiscal sponsorship. So small organizations that are out trying to do big things, but they don't have nonprofit status. They use ours, so they can go out and fundraise, offer tax deductibility because they're using our 501c3. So a good example would be there was a group of youngsters involved in baseball and their parents that wanted to build an Eden Prairie Miracle Field, a field specially designed for, you know, disabled youngsters, you know, a hard surface that could be used by wheelchairs, for example. And so they used us as their fiscal sponsorship. They went out and raised their own money, but we served as the conduit for their funds. That was a $250,000 project that they got built over at Flying Cloud Fields. So that's an example of the kind of tool that we can offer smaller organizations right now. Eden Prairie Local News is another one, and they now have their own 501c3, but they didn't for the first year and a half to 2 years, and they used our fiscal sponsorship.
Okay.
And then lastly, if I could just mention a unique tool, is this ability to create special funds. So, you know, we were one of the first in Minnesota to create a COVID-19 response fund. And that was in March 2020, just as the lockdown was taking effect in Minnesota. And we knew that nonprofits would be struggling to provide services under different circumstances. We wanted to make sure there were funds available to help them. And so we created this fund and almost immediately raised $75,000 and issued quick response grants to people like Prop, you know, to generate more food donations, and the Prop Shop to tackle a list of families that, you know, needed beds, for example, and just do a lot of things, grief counseling, PPE equipment, things like that. Those were some of the initial grants from that fund.
Okay. So in other words, a group of concerned citizens, not necessarily a 501c3, and particularly not a 501c3, they're just not at that bandwidth, and they come to Eden Prairie Foundation. Here's our agenda. Eden Prairie Foundation says, we'll get behind you and we'll use our contacts to help you raise money. Is that basically the deal?
Well, they kind of raise their own money,
Yeah,
but we take care of the money they raise. We
okay,
take care of it, we keep it protected. The foundation is audited every year, so they can be assured that the money is taken care of. We provide a small number of administrative services, thanking their donors, again, offering that tax deductibility, letting the community know that this fund exists,
gotcha.
things like that.
Yeah, okay, that's really cool. That's, that would be a whole nother subject area in itself. I want to keep the topic on you. So, you know, and you're about to move on to your next act, if you will. Tell me a few things about what you'll always remember about your work in Eden Prairie.
Wow, that's a good question. Well, I've talked about how growth has been such a theme, you know, throughout. I would say, again, the terrific people I've worked with. I mean, really terrific people. So many people that are interested in giving back to the community. I think you don't see that everywhere, but you do see it in Eden Prairie. You know, there's been some quirky stuff over the years. Just things that pop into my head, like the Minneapolis Aquatennial used to have a hot air balloon race, and they would launch the balloons from the property next to Eden Prairie Shopping Center, you know, back in the early days, because it was kind of empty land. And so getting the chance to go up in one of those balloons and float over Eden Prairie was pretty awesome. Flooding of the Minnesota River. I remember covering that story and talking to Seaver Peterson, an Eden Prairie farmer, who was really accustomed to this kind of regular flooding. Seaver would take one of his tractors and attach a rope to it, and he'd get one of his nephews at the end of that rope, and they would water ski the flooded rivers with Seaver going along the banks there as fast as he could go with that tractor, with pulling this nephew behind him on a ski rope. That was quite an image to see. So
Take him water skiing on his tractor.
yeah,
That's not a typical thing.
so just kind of random things like that.
Yeah.
And the preservation of parks and open space, I think, is part of what made Eden Prairie unique. So some of that land overlooking the Minnesota River Valley, building of schools. I mean, for a while there, we were building schools, it seemed like every other year. And the school district had this amazing success rate with referendums. That was, I'm sure it would be hard to compare with any city in the state. It was just amazing. So, you know, things like that stand out.
I can understand that completely. What would you say have been or are some of Eden Prairie's greatest challenges?
Yeah. So a lot of the growth that I was referencing, you know, happened really quick. And I would say that was a challenge, and they really met that challenge, I think, by having some early plans in place. So the city had what it called a guide plan that it had put together in the late 70s, knowing that they were going to be really next in line to grow. And so that's how they met that challenge. And I would say having high standards. So, you know, they had some pretty high standards for development. These projects were forced to comply with.
Yeah. I heard a lot of grumbling from developers.
I remember one project, it was Kentucky Fried Chicken. Of course, Kentucky Fried Chicken is famous for this red and white, is a cupola
Yeah.
that they would, kind of put at the top of its structure.
Yep.
And the city spent some time talking about whether that should be red or a terracotta, more earth tone color to it, which kind of tells you that's kind of the hold that they had over developers who really wanted to be here, but there was kind of a price to be paid, and I think that paid off in things like landscaping.
Sure.
You see a lot of landscaping around development in Eden Prairie, to the point where some of these schools that were built, they're almost hard to see from the road. Some of them, there's earthen berms and landscaping. So, a lot of that was done carefully, and I think there's a payoff there, for residents today.
Sure, truly. What would you say are currently this community's biggest challenges or biggest opportunities? What do you see in Eden Prairie's future?
Yeah, I think that the growing diversity of the community is both a challenge and an opportunity. So I think the challenge is getting everyone to the table, where the decisions are made. So having that diversity in leadership and the decision makers, I would say. But that's such an opportunity, I think, because the different perspectives and the viewpoints and the talents and the expertise, I think that's just waiting to be tapped. So I think there's a big payoff there if Eden Prairie can deliver on getting everybody to the table there and participating. Because it is a challenge. So I was here when everything in Eden Prairie was bright, shiny, and new, right? Things were being developed right and left, and what's the latest new store, the new development, the latest new neighborhood, everything looked great. And now we're getting to the point where we're an aging community in more ways than one, both the residents, but also the housing, the infrastructure.
Yep.
And so it's going to be a challenge to be a highly desirable community in light of that.
Yeah. So what's next for you?
Yeah. So some of that is uncharted territory, really, by design. So I feel like I am retiring early enough. I'm 66, so I'm in fair shape. I'm mobile. I can do a lot of things at this age.
So you're gonna do some experimenting.
Right, I'm gonna figure it out.
Yeah.
And
Any themes that go with that, like
Yeah.
around the world cruises, or?
no, here's the theme. The theme really is just to find joy in every day, as trite as that might sound, but that's the goal here. And yeah, that's going to include some travel, some volunteer work. First grandchild is on the way this summer, but a lot of it I'm just going to figure out along the way.
Well, that leads me to perhaps the most important set of questions in this whole interview. You have a family?
Yeah.
Tell me about your family.
Yeah. Well, I feel like my wife is fairly well known because she's been at every foundation event, that we've had pretty much over the last 8.5 years. Roma. And Roma is recently retired, and she's already at work volunteering for folks like Let's Go Fishing and Mission Animal Hospital and some other folks, so she's really figuring it out. We have 2 grown sons
Okay.
in their early 30s. Craig, who's married to Anna. They live in St. Louis Park. They have their first child on the way. Anna's a school teacher. Craig works for the Federal Reserve Bank. Our youngest is Grant.
Okay.
Grant lives in Minneapolis. He works for Polaris Industries.
Okay. So both your sons are local?
Both local, which is the reason we'll be sticking around Eden Prairie.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And they're both married?
Grant is not married.
Okay.
Craig is.
Okay. And you mentioned something about a grandchild?
A grandson on the way this summer, so we're really excited about that.
Yeah. All right.
Really excited about that.
Well, I know what's next for you now.
Well, you know, I've had grandparent envy for
Yeah.
quite a while here,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. That's that is exciting. So, all right. I can't think of anything. You want to ask something?
What is it that you would like to say to the young people 20 years from now about your experience in Eden Prairie?
Well, it was very rewarding to be an eyewitness to, 40 years of Eden Prairie history. And not just to be an eyewitness, but to document a lot of that. I feel good that it's been documented, and a lot of the stories that I did are now in possession of the Eden Prairie Historical Society for all time, hopefully. So I would say the young people 20 years from now, check it out. It was a fascinating time in Eden Prairie's history, and I enjoyed it immensely, whether we're talking about the Eden Prairie News or the Eden Prairie Community Foundation. I just enjoyed that. And I would lastly say, just give back to your community. That's been the secret here. That's really, I think, the reason Eden Prairie has done well. It's because people like you have given back to their community, and if we can keep that up, we're going to be in good shape.
Yeah. Yeah.
One more question, which won't go into the larger community, but for posterity. What was the strangest thing that ever happened to you as a reporter?
I don't know if it was strange. I would say there were many humbling moments along the way. I once got called to the superintendent of schools' office about something I wrote. It was a lot like going to the principal's office for having done something bad. That was kind of a surreal experience in my life. Being welcomed in people's homes was kind of also surreal. People who didn't know me at all, but wanted to tell their story. And so it was, yeah, come on over, come on in, have a cup of coffee, sit down. And so that was always an interesting experience to have people welcome me into their homes and be willing to share their stories.
Why do you think it's important for people to tell their story?
Well, people have stories to tell. They don't often realize it, at the time. But just their experiences in Eden Prairie are probably worth telling. I mean, right now, the Historical Society does this fantastic Facebook page called Eden Prairie Remembers. And just noting something in Eden Prairie's past, I see how that engages people and how interested people are. I mean, everybody wants to feel like their life was noteworthy, worth something.
Mhm.
And so I think when you allow people and encourage people to tell their stories, that's kind of gratifying to them, first of all. And I think it's valuable to the community, right? I do anyway.